Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another interactive session hosted by Caucus, the esteemed discussion forum of Hindu College. Today, we are privileged to host Professor Patrick Olivelle, who will share his insights on the topic, Reflections on India's Ancient Past. Although Professor Olivelle truly needs no introduction, it is only fitting that we acknowledge his remarkable contributions. Professor Patrick Olivelle is Professor Emeritus of Asian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. He studied Sanskrit and Indian religions at the undergraduate level at Oxford University and obtained a doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania for producing a critical edition and translation of Yadava Prakasa's Yatidharma Prakasa. His research interests are wide and include Sanskrit, ancient Indian religious studies, ancient Indian ascetic traditions, and the history of Idea of Dharma. Over his illustrious academic career, Professor Olivelle has received numerous accolades and fellowships from institutions such as Wolfson College, University of Oxford, the American Institute of Indian Studies, and the Smithsonian Institution. Professor Olivelle was honored in 1997 by the University of Western Michigan as the Mircea Eliade Lecturer in Comparative Religion and as the 2001 Gonda Lecturer at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today, we are delighted to have him here and look forward to enriching and exchanging of ideas. Moving on, now I would like to invite the esteemed president of Caucus, Pushkar Pandey, to introduce the society.
Thank you very much, Saksham. I'll try to be as brief as I can. So Caucus, the discussion forum, was formed in 2007, initially to discuss foreign affairs and international relations, and that's why we exclusively, at one stage, or almost exclusively, used to engage in Model United Nations. But whether we like it or not, the fact remains that despite the past being very distant and almost being chimeric in several ways, it emerges in public discourse relentlessly, especially in the global south and in post-colonial contexts where the origins of culture and tradition are of great importance to erstwhile colonies. And it is for this precise reason that we send an invitation to Professor Patrick Olivelle, one of the greatest and, if I might say, the most diverse Indologists and scholars of ancient Indian history and culture that you'll find, from writing on the Upanishads, that is Vedanta, to writing on the Dharmasutras, to translating the Manav Dharmashastra and the Vishnu Dharmashastra, writing on folk culture, writing on social history as well. He has a wonderful book on the interlude between the Mauryans and the Guptas. So given the diverse scholarship of Professor Olivelle, we thought that we couldn't find, or we would be hard-pressed to find a candidate who would match up to him to discuss the topic under consideration today, reflections on India's ancient past. So for the format of this session, we have a rough questionnaire that we'll present before Professor Olivelle, after which we'll be opening the floor to questions from the audience. But to start off, before we actually ask theme-specific questions, I would like Professor Olivelle to briefly reflect upon his career and how he actually chose to study Sanskrit and Indian religion, because I mean, ever since William Jones made his rather famous comparison between Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, the three languages are pitted against each other invariably. So we're very intrigued to know how Professor Olivelle chose the path that he did. Over to you, Professor Olivelle.
Thank you very much, Pushkar, and thank you, Saksham, for your introduction. Let me try to get this. Okay. All right, thank you. Well, unfortunately, life is not generally planned, as we all know. Things happen in life that makes you go one way or the other. And my life has been one of many accidents that have pushed me in one direction or the other. but most of them have been lucky accidents. So, for example, I had studied European philosophy first, and then wanted to concentrate on Buddhism, because I come from Sri Lanka, and Buddhism was the main religion there. So I went to Oxford, hoping and wanting to study Buddhism, but Oxford undergraduate degree did not have anything that dealt with Buddhism. So I ended up doing an honors degree in Sanskrit with Pali as my second language. So that was my introduction to Sanskrit as a mainstream language. When I came to Pennsylvania, I wanted to refocus on Buddhism, but the people who were there, the main professors I had, were doing other work. So my main tutor, my advisor, mentor, was Professor Ludo Roche. And Professor Roche was working on Dharmasutras. So my early work tried to combine the two by not going Buddhist way, but going the Hindu way, doing the Brahminical ascetic traditions, and which is part of the Dharmashastric world. So that's where I did my doctorate, and then the rest is history. You go different paths, and I, 10 years into my career, went more closely following Professor Roche's path, working on my major work was the critical edition of the Manava Dharmashastra. And then I was invited to translate the Upanishads by Oxford University Press for their World's Classics series, and that's how I got into that. Then I was invited by somebody else to translate the Panchatantra, so I got into that. So those are all often, there's no high planning. It's like life, and it's like a country where, even though many countries have 5-year plans and 10-year plans, we know that none of them work, right? The economy has its own way of doing things. So my trajectory has been like that. I was fortunate to come from Indiana University, where I first worked for 17 years, to the University of Texas, which had a much larger group of scholars working on India. And that helped me with regard to funding and resources. The library was very good. So that's where I am. And I retired 10 years ago. And so I'm now a retired person, but I do still keep close contact with the university and my colleagues there. So that's my brief biography. I think that's the least interesting part of today's work with us. But to a degree, I think what my own biography shows is that it is difficult to separate, to make silos of India's history, present and past. And you see how much the past is invoked in today's Indian politics. Past is almost viewed as a guarantor or shaping the present. So I think to a degree, we should not put ourselves in silos. Buddhism did not exist in India in its own watertight compartment. It was in dialogue with everyone else. And that's important for us to understand. And the second thing I want to tell you about what I want to do, one thing we need to cultivate in life as well as especially in scholarship is humility. Humility is a central virtue, I think, in scholarship. Because what we do not know is so much larger than what we know. And we should be willing always to acknowledge or ignorance, that we do not know answers to questions we may have. So today, as I go answering some of your questions, you will see that I will often say, I do not know. Not just that I do not know, no one knows, right? So, and that is important. And the second thing I want to mention as we go is, there's a saying I'm sure you have come across. In life, familiarity breeds contempt. You don't appreciate people with whom you are very familiar, right? They're your buddies. Somewhere far away out there, you say, oh, he's this wonderful man, wonderful woman. But in scholarship, familiarity, I think, breeds acceptance. When something is repeated over and over again for over a century or two, then you think that is the truth. That's acceptance. And I think a major task of scholarship is to make the familiar unfamiliar. To make the familiar unfamiliar. We have to continually question the assumptions which have been taught to us by our teachers, by our books, by a century or two of scholarship. I recently contributed an article to the Contributions to Indian Sociology, which is published by the University of Delhi Center for Economic Growth. Professor Madan is the one who started it in India. But Louis Dumont started the Contributions to Indian Sociology in France. And I, in that article it's available, The World Renouncer and the Man in the World, Revisiting an Old Paradigm, where I tried to trace my own intellectual history, where I was very, very influenced by Louis Dumont's theories in the first 20 years of my life as a scholar. And then I began to question those presuppositions that Dumont has given to the world. And that's what I'm trying to do there. And my last point here would be the last part of my biography, was my biography of Ashoka. A genre of writing that I had never engaged in before, never written a biography of anybody. And again, an accident. I talked about accidents. It was Dr. Ramachandra Guha who was starting his 40-volume series of biographies of major Indians called Indian Lives, asked me if I would write a biography for the series. And I looked at it and said, the only person I could really write about, I know something about, is Ashoka. And then the real problem of writing a biography of Ashoka is the fact that we know very little about him. There are no contemporary accounts of him. There aren't other people who wrote about him. But we have something that we don't have with regard to other major ancient people, such as Alexander the Great, for example, like Chandragupta, the grandfather of Ashoka, or of anyone of India's past, of the Buddha, for example. What we have from Ashoka is his own writings. It's about 4,500 words. Not a lot, but quite a lot coming from that. And what we know is that we have it exactly the way he wrote it, because they were inscribed on stone and pillars, right? This is something we don't have. What we have from the past are editions and transcriptions over thousands of years. So we do not know when they were actually written. So that is how I worked on the biography of Ashoka, experimenting with looking at a person's own words to see. I don't call it a biography, I call it a portrait. What sort of a portrait of this person emerges as you read closely what he has written. With that, I'll stop and Pushkar, take over.
Thank you so much, sir. You've given us a really vast canvas on which we can explore today's topic and some of these themes that you have worked on. I want to start off by asking a bit of a historiographical question. By the way, I hope I'm audible and clearly visible to everyone in the meeting, right?
Everybody okay?
So
Yeah, you are.
the first question is slightly historiographical or one of intellectual history. In India, for a very long time, especially post-independence, scholars of decoloniality have argued that the Oriental scholarship, and with it all the philological work, the ethnographic work, and all the investigations that they embarked on, was for the fundamental purpose of reinforcing and justifying colonialism. And due to this ideological underpinning, they happen to say that this is a blemish that can't be done away with, and they argue for rejecting all such works. Now, since I've immensely worked on translations as well, and one major aspect of 19th century Oriental scholarship was the tyranny of philology, as I think Ada Gobini put it. How do you assess the Oriental enterprise of understanding the South Asian past? Do you think it was objective? Should we do with it or should we do away with it? How do you assess this phase of history?
Yeah. Scholarship from the past and from the present suffer a blemish, as you said, a blemish that cannot be eliminated from you and from me. We have the blemish of bias. We are all in some sense biased. If I were writing, if my life trajectory did not bring me to the places where I have been, what I write would have been somewhat different. So the biases are existent in every scholarly endeavor. The issue is, how much do these biases impinge on the scholarly work itself? Let's take what was done in the 19th century and the early 20th century, right? The earliest dictionary on modern scientific terms on Sanskrit was done by Bertling and Roth, two German scholars, writing in St. Petersburg, Russia, of all places, right? All right. So they were Europeans of the 19th century, writing around 1850, 1860. Right? If you want to study Sanskrit, should we dismiss this monumental dictionary of Sanskrit because it was done by the colonials? I think not. I use that dictionary all the time because that's the only major dictionary we have of Sanskrit. As you know, the Pune dictionary, which is supposed to be very, very good, has not gone beyond the letter A. Right? It has all the other letters to go through. And I don't think it will be done in my lifetime for sure, but I don't think it will be done in your lifetime either. Right? Okay. So the issue, of course, is that with regard to people in the colonial past, you can't put all of them in the same boat. Think of the people who wrote about India in the colonial past. There were Germans, there were French, there were Italians, there were Americans, and there was a lot of British. Right? I think we lost somebody. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you. We
Yeah,
can hear
okay.
you. Please go ahead.
Okay. So not all of them were working. Take for example, George Bühler. George Bühler was a German, Austrian German, who became the professor of Sanskrit at in Vienna. But I'm getting your okay. Let me take this view to gallery. Okay, that's better. George Bühler spent a lot of time in India at Ferguson College, Bombay. He spent a lot of time in Kashmir. Some of the discoveries he made of manuscripts in Kashmir is still used, right? He was very different from much talked about Max Muller, who never stepped foot into India. He was in Germany and in Oxford, right? So what I'm trying to tell you, people, is that not everybody who wrote during the colonial period was a colonialist, or if he was a colonialist, not everything you do, for example, let's take A. Keith, who did a lot of work on Vedic texts, and the only Brahmanas that were translated even today into a modern language were done by Keith and others, the Shatapada Brahmana by Egelin, the Aitreya Brahmana by Keith. So there are basic texts of translation that we have today. So my plea is, let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. Let's not throw the baby with the bath. We have to read what they wrote judiciously and critically. But not reading them is a cop-out, right? To critique somebody, you should know what they're saying. You brought the term philology. Philology has gotten a bad reputation, the name, not just in India or people who you're talking about, but also in this country. Philology is dead, many people say. Most people who talk about philology don't know what philology is and never done it. Right? Philology for me is a close reading of a text. That philological work is the greatest honor one can give to a person in the past who wrote something that we are reading today. We are taking that person's words seriously. That requires close attention. He uses words that we may not be familiar with because we are separated by 2000 years. How do we understand him? So we have to find out how those words were used by other people around the same time. That is philology. What I did with regard to Ashoka's biography was a work of philology. Because I had the words of Ashoka, but I had to interpret them. I had to understand them. What was he trying to say? I had to see one inscription separated by a few years from another inscription to see, is he speaking differently? Is he giving something new? Is there a diachronic change in his ideas? So those are all important things. That is philology. So I think philology has been viewed as something that is less than scholarly, rejected by people who have never done philology. That's what I think is. Because if you think of philology as close reading of texts, if a text is worth reading, then it is worth reading closely, understanding what that author was trying to tell us, having respect for that author, not reading a translation of the Upanishads and thinking that you know everything, because the translation is given, mediated by somebody else who is trying to tell what the author was trying to say. So philology requires the knowledge of the language, which is not easy, as you all know. I'm sure many of you have done linguistic work. Learning a new language is not easy. Learning an ancient language is even more difficult. That is the respect we give to the people we study. If you can't do that, then we should probably not study that period in history. That's my view of this whole controversy. I don't think it's a controversy of philology, I think. Okay, let's go.
Thank you, Professor Olivelle, for that wonderful answer. I'm Anshul. My question to you is that in the construct of a civilization per se, it has occupied like a very central role in historical scholarship in India, and particularly in the present day context. But it also dates back from like colonial times when such a construct was invoked by nationalist historians to sort of present a particular vision of India's past. Even Marxist historians like Kosambi, for example, would accept that the essential continuity of Indian civilization is there amidst, like he has mentioned, vestiges of living prehistory, right? So, in your sort of assessment, is this an oversimplification, or can we indeed have like an essential civilization that underlies the vast span of Indian history?
Yeah. So, I use the word Indian civilization all the time. So, I don't think that's something that we need to get up. But we need to realize that every category humans make does not refer to always something out there. When we say a tree, the term tree, for example, we know Sora more or less what. But when you come to the fringes, is it a shrub? Is it a plant? Is it a tree? Our categories, classifications are our own experiences and knowledge. Indian civilization is like that. We see some things happening in a particular geographical area. And we think that there are certain continuities in mythologies, continuities in religions, continuities in architecture, continuities in human beings, genetics, right? So I think we may think that we can establish a certain something over there that holds together, and we call it a civilization. We call it. Is there something essential? I'm always suspicious of essences when you are dealing with history. Essence comes from the Aristotelian philosophy that distinguished between essence and accident. Essence was unchanging, permanent, durable. Accidents change. So Patrick Olivelle is that essence, he would say, remains unchanged. As I grew old, I became bigger, my hair, I lost my hair became gray, I have wrinkles, I'm not what I used to be when I was 20, right? That's accidents, they say. I don't believe there's such an essence in anything, especially in civilization. Indian history, all of you are historians, is so vast, so cumbersome, so regionally, ethnically, linguistically diverse. Because of that, it is so rich that you cannot boil it down to an essence. The best I think we can do is to use the category that the German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein did, called family resemblances. You know, two boys look alike, so they must be brothers. But there's nothing really essence there that you can point to. Maybe today you can do genetics, right? Okay. But family resemblance is not an essence, but there are similarities that make certain cohesiveness. And I think we can do that with regard to India, Indian civilization. But there's, I prefer always in my historical work diversity over uniformity. Diversity brings richness. Dharmasutras says that people are living fuller lives. Everybody is not doing the same thing. It's not like a Lego block all carved in the same way. People are different. People have different thoughts. Indians spoke literally dozens of languages. So are we going to say that the person who is in Tamil Nadu in a village thinks and does the same thing as a person in Kashmir? I'm not talking today. I'm talking about 1,000 years ago now, right? So this is always the problem for me with regard to this civilizational issue. I'm willing to admit that there is a certain cohesion in India, right? You can say a certain thing in Tamil Nadu that will be understood in Kashmir or Bengal, but would not be understood in Japan or England, right? So there is a certain, there is that, and that is important, understanding. But also equally important, or even more important, to understand what do the Tamils do differently from the Kashmiris and from the Bengalis and from the Gujaratis, right? And that is, I think, an important point. What do you do with the Sri Lankans? Do they belong to the Indian civilization? Or are they separate? You see, the problem, once you get to the extremities, it becomes very, very difficult. Where does this Indian civilization end? Does it go to Pakistan? Does it go to Afghanistan? After all, Ashoka has inscriptions in Afghanistan, Kandahar. Does it go to Bangladesh? Does it go to Myanmar? Does it go to Thailand? But after all, Buddhism went to all those places. So once you get underneath, it becomes rather little messy, I think. Yeah.
Just a thematic follow-up on that question. Some scholars nowadays prefer the term South Asian studies to, say, Indology. So, what significance does such a change in terminology have, according to you?
Yeah. I mean, we change labels all the time, right? They don't matter very much. Sometimes a particular label, and that's part of human language. Some words are used for a long time, but due to historical circumstances, takes on a certain baggage that becomes offensive to some people, right? Like in India, untouchables, right? The word was there. Gandhi came that it was offensive to people. So you try to find new words for it. Harijan, Dalit, right? I'm sure when you are as old as I am, these words will be found to be offensive. And you may find new nomenclature to refer to certain kinds of people. In India, people are called Negroes and niggers, right? That was an offensive term. So it came with other words. The blacks came, right? Or African Americans came. So there are all these. How does the word South Asian come? People don't realize that South Asia was created as a category in the Cold War, American State Department. Okay, all right. Because the world was divided by the foreign policy of the United States and Western countries into various regions. So there was the East Asia and there was South Asia. That's how South Asia came into being. Right? I know it has certain geographical relevance, sure, but the nomenclature came that way, and many of the American universities and European universities use the word Oriental studies to refer to the study of Asia. After Said and all of that, Orientalism became a bad word, right? You have to change all of that. So people started using the word Asian or South Asian or East Asian language. So that's, I think that, yes, I'm all for it for the simple reason that you don't want to use offensive languages that give offense to people. But I also think that it is not a serious thing. It's a serious thing that you don't want to give offense. That's a very important thing. It doesn't change what you are doing, actually, right? And I think what you are doing is you are sometimes changing. I'm sure at some point in history, South Asian also will become somewhat offensive, and we will search for a new word to. So at my age, I don't take that all very seriously. We are going through a debate now. There's a major society, academic society in America called the American Oriental Society. American Oriental Society deals with the world from Greece to Japan. That is the Orient, right? How do you find a word to do that? So we're having a big discussion. So you can see how silly sometimes this can become. So we have, at least temporarily, we have stopped calling it American Oriental Society, but just call it AOS. Just the initials, right? It's the same thing, but you're not using the word Oriental. Just put an O there. So those are difficult areas. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Olivelle, for that answer. So now we'll move on to a roughly chronological structure for the subsequent sections, starting with the later Vedic age. So over to you, Pushkar.
Thank you, Anshu. With the rise of and like once again, this question is also somewhat rooted in the present, despite the appeal to chronology being made here.
Yes.
So with Swami Vivekananda and the rise of Neo Vedanta, we find that the Indian intellectual elite has had a fascinating with Vedanta, but Vedanta, with its emphasis on metempsychosis, seems to be rather different from the earlier Vedic philosophy. So much so that when I was reading Johannes Bronkhorst's work on Greater Magadha, he attributes the entire baggage of samsara and metempsychosis and karma and all these doctrines to a source separate from Vedic philosophy. So how do you trace the emergence of the ideas of the Upanishads and the later Vedic philosophy, and what relation did these have with the Shramanic philosophies of the time of, let's say, the second urbanization?
Yeah. So my real problem here, including what Johannes Bronkhorst writes, is what do you mean by Vedic? People think that they know what Vedic is. I have no idea what Vedic is. Does it mean what is found in the texts called the Vedas that we have with us? That seems to be the easiest way to define Vedic. Okay. But what we have, the texts we have, the Brahmanical tradition itself says, is a small portion of what existed. Lot has been lost. Right? Okay. That's one thing. So when you say Vedic, we are talking about something that historical accidents have made survive up to today, right? So how we are saying something that has survived here, does this thing that happened 3,000 years ago come from this? Doesn't make any sense historically. It has to come from something that existed at the time, not what has survived to today, right? Okay. Vedic texts, or what we call Vedic, was written by whom? Pushkar. Who composed these things?
Well, tradition thinks they are Aparushaya, but we don't really know who specifically wrote the texts.
But at least they are coming from the Brahmanical tradition. Brahmanical tradition, Brahman demographically was a small elite group of people, right? And what is more, since we have women in attendance, who wrote these things, men or women? Huh?
Men.
So we have basically taken half of the population out of this. And of that other half, very small portion. What I'm trying to say is that what we call Vedic is a very small elite tradition. There was a lot of things happening in India at the time. We have no idea what they are. The problem of Bronkhorst, I think, is that he's trying to derive what Indian tradition has given us, like the ascetic tradition, rebirth theory, karma theory, all of that, from what we have survived until now. It is true that these ideas do not occur in the Vedic text that we have today. That is not to say that it did not exist in Vedic text we may not have today. Second, there were a lot of other intellectual traditions in India. Buddhist tradition bears witness to that. And many of these could have come from there. What I think is important, what Johannes Bronkhorst has said, is we have to take not just chronology into account when we do history, but also geography. What happens in what is today Uttar Pradesh may not be exactly what is happening in what is today Bihar, which is Magadha, right? There may be different intellectual traditions. We have to be sensitive to that, I think, when we do history. But this is where humility comes in. Where did the doctrine of rebirth and karma come from? I'm willing to say we do not know. We can make some educated guesses, and Bronkhorst does one of them. But if you look at Bronkhorst's theory, he says it comes from Magadha, right? It comes from Magadha. Okay. What sort of text do we have from Magadha? We do not know. Buddhist texts are there. We presume that they were written in Magadha, but there was so much change, and over the years, we do not know where they are. There's giant texts. Many of them are very late. What we know for sure was from Magadha is the Ashokan inscriptions. They were written in Magadha by Ashoka, and we have exactly those things as they were written. The theories of rebirth and karma are not found in any of them. So we say they are coming from Magadha, but the only Magadhan texts that we have do not mention them. So what I'm trying to say is that it is really complicated. And however, good Johannes, a good friend of mine, does is that there is a lot of uncertainty there, I think. With regard to Vedanta, here again, have you all heard an expression called pizza effect? No, you're not heard of it. Okay, you know what a pizza is, right? We have eaten pizzas.
Yes.
Pizza was an Italian bread that came to America, and Americans improved on it, put stuff on it, like we do today. And then it went back to Italy, and the Italians accepted it as their own. So you have something coming from somewhere, going somewhere else, and coming back and being accepted as part of their culture. I think Vedanta, something like that happened. The much maligned colonialist writings about India gave the Indian intellectuals of the 19th and early 20th century an idea of what India was like. And Vedanta, especially the Shankarite Vedanta, remember, Vedanta is a very broad tradition, right? It has many, many aspects. There are the Madhavas coming in there, Ramanujas coming in there, Vishishtadvaitas coming in there, the Shuddhadvaitas, there are whole sorts of people there, right? The Shankara Advaita, the monistic tradition, grabbed the imagination of the West, and it went back. So Radhakrishnan writes about Hinduism, and when he writes about Hinduism, he is more or less writing about Neo-Vedanta, tradition. So this is where I think it's important to realize that Vedanta was not Indian philosophy. It's one of Indian philosophies. There are many other significant aspects of Indian philosophy that are only now beginning to be, especially in the area of logic. Logic is a strong area of Indian philosophy that was not really especially Navya Nyaya, the new forms of logic that happened in the late medieval period, that is being examined by philosophers both in India and in the West as a real philosophical tradition of India. So Vedanta is significant and important, I think. But again, the richness of India's philosophy cannot be boiled down to one thing like Shankarite Vedanta. Anything?
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. On
Anything?
a slightly related theme, since the conventional narrative that we have also read in school books is that the emergence of the caste system is something that gradually occurs with social differentiation in the later Vedic period, and then it heightens with state formation. So I'm merging a couple of issues here, since you mentioned, I think Louis Dumont in your initial statement. And if I am not mistaken, Dumont also talks about or questions the applicability of an economic logic, the way Moses Finlay did with respect to the ancient economy in the Greek context. So, how does one trace the emergence of the caste system? Did it operate or emerge due to a traditional economic rationale, or was there a ritualistic aspect to it, the way Orientalists sort of asserted that material concerns are subordinate and that ritualistic concerns were more important? So how does one deal with the emergence of the caste system at this period?
Yeah. So what if we talked about this topic without using the word caste? Because that's not a word that is found in ancient India. Right? I think using the word caste immediately colors our discourse, because caste, since the 19th century colonial period, has dominated the conversation. The term came from Portuguese, after all, right? It is not an Indian term at all. If you were 1,000 years ago in India, 3,000 years ago in India, what word would you use to discuss this topic? I'm not trying to use the C word here, right? I'm not trying to use the C word. If you're not using the C word, what word would you use? Perhaps if you use that, we may be able to look at this a little bit differently, without the baggage that we bring to it, moment we say caste, right? The word that is being used in ancient texts is jati, the jati. And jati is simply in Sanskrit, birth. And in philosophy, jati is used for what we would call today species. There are many jatis of animals, the species of animals. And when you say jati for in the human context, it becomes to say some kind of a group that is related by birth. It does not bring in any economic considerations into it, right? Yes, texts in India say that certain jatis have certain professions and certain occupations, right? That is true. But we must realize that generally in ancient times, children followed their parents' or father's profession. If father was a fisherman, you became a fisherman. You became an apprentice as with the father, etc. So that is connected there. I think also that we confuse two aspects of Indian thinking, ancient Indian thinking, about social formations of this of groups. One is jati, which, if you take it as that, it is simply a statement that there are different groups in a society. In the terms of jati, you do not make a distinction between who is up and who is down, who is above and who is below. Right? But there's another concept called Varna coming in. That the two becomes fused in the and I think that is the Varna from the very beginning, when the Rig Veda 1090 hymn about the Purusha, from the very beginning, some text that was written probably around 1000 before Christ, Varna, what I call Varna ideology, has hierarchy built into it. Hierarchy is an essential part of the Varna ideology. And it is this Varna ideology that then becomes part of the Jati ideology within the Brahminical usage of that. How did it all begin? Varna is easier to comprehend. You find the distinction of society in the Indo-European context too, into a royal, priestly, and ordinary farmers, normal people. So Kshatriya, Vaishya, Kshatriya, Brahmana, Vaishya, and the Shudra being the servant class. So that I think is a easier to understand and explain. But how influential this hierarchical Varna ideology in ancient and medieval India was is a matter for debate. I think taking it out of this caste thing allows us to speak about it more neutrally in a way. Somebody tell me, but you are saying that there was no caste in ancient India. I never said that. Because there was no caste, because the word caste didn't exist in ancient India. There existed other forms of social organization in ancient India. What I'm asking is, if you were going around, say, Andhra Pradesh, 1,000 years ago, and you asked a person, who are you? How would that person reply? Will that person say, I'm a Kshatriya? I'm a Vaishya? I think not, because we do have inscriptions from that time. And my colleague here, Cynthia Talbot, has written a book on that. The identity of these people. They identify themselves by what they did. He was like saying, I'm a school teacher. Right? Today we will say, I'm an engineer. Right? Even if I'm a doctor. And she could see over a period of time, 100 years, the children of the people who wrote inscriptions themselves wrote inscriptions and changed their identity because they have moved up from being a minor bureaucrat to become a higher bureaucrat. So the issue is, I think, I'm not trying to answer this question because it can't be answered, but I'm trying to say is that the whole thing is more complex. One final point here. I think the European scholars who gave India the idea of caste in terms of ideology, not caste. I don't believe in that Europeans created caste. That's not true. But the Europeans understood the Indian system through the texts, through the lens given by Brahminical authors of Dharmasutras. That's where I am. So it's a pizza effect. You went there, Brahmins gave them the material, they brought it and made it into a theory, sociological theory, and brought it back to India, right? So if you don't use that lens that is given to us by the Brahminical text of Dharmasutras, we may have a very different picture of what these Jati organizations in ancient India were like, how they related to each other, and how they operated within that. I think we may have a different idea.
Professor Olivelle for that answer. So, state is based on a monopoly of violence or a monopoly of coercion, as many say, and it intrinsically relates us to the rule of law in society as well. And on that note, given that particularly, say, Kautilya's Arthashastra has been quite influential on the note of Dharma and its ideal image of the portrayal of what an Indian state may look like, and, since years, many have drawn inspiration from those as well. So, a couple of
Yes.
questions on that note, which is, from what we discern of the Arthashastra, was
Yeah.
the pre-modern state as pervasive as a modern undifferentiated Leviathan-esque monolith that we have currently? And secondly, could you also elaborate on how Kautilya's Arthashastra probably built up in the Arthashastra tradition of authors such as Brihaspati's work, and how influential was the text back in its day when it was conceived of?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you're asking two questions. How pervasive was the state in ancient India, especially in terms of empire that you had asked also. Uh, and, uh, and, and, and here again, we are not there. We don't have documentation. We can have theories of empire, right? How did empires work in other countries, like in Persia, like in Rome, right? Like in China. Um, and and there were different levels, you know, of intrusion into the ordinary lives of people. You ask a question, why is there an empire or a king? What are we trying to do? Ashoka is a bad example because he was trying to do something new, something different. But most kings wanted to be rich. So it was an extractive state, right? Taxation, trying to take. But they had to be careful. That's where the text like Kautilya comes in. You don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg, right? You can be too extractive and kill the entrepreneurial spirit of the people. If you take all what the farmer makes, then he has no incentive to make anymore. Right? So you had to. But I think the short answer to this would be that except for somebody like Ashoka, as Fussman says with regard to the Maurya Empire, the state the empire had an interest in keeping transportation free, keep rebellions down, but they had no interest in running a place like we do today in a modern state, right? It goes all the way down to the municipal level, to the who looks after your road, planning permissions and all of that. So I think so that sense I agree. The state was not as interested. Ashoka is different. He, at least in his statements, whether it was actually true or not, he had the idea of having mass education of people to live moral lives, dharmic lives. Dharma is important for him. So that he has that, and he tries to do that through inscriptions and his bureaucracy, extensive imperial bureaucracy. He says he used to do that. So that may have been somewhat different. So it could be, with regard to Arthashastra, on the other hand, that is the work of Arthashastra that we have. It had probably a strong beginning. It had an impact on the intellectual tradition of India because it is referred to over and over again by other texts. Even the Panchatantra at the beginning pays homage to Chanakya, right? So because it presents itself as Arthashastra, the Panchatantra. But unfortunately, this text, probably because it was absorbed into the Dharmasutras tradition of Brahmins, basically didn't have an intellectual home for it to thrive. Dharmasastra thrived because it had an intellectual home. There were There were students studying them, teachers teaching them, and all of that. That was so that when it came to the 19th century, early 20th century, there was only one manuscript of the text available in the whole of India. And a few copies of that. Fortunately, thank God for people from Kerala who maintain these texts, right? Kerala has always maintained some old text. And without the Kerala intervention, we would not even have that, right? So the issue is, how influential was the Arthashastra in the intellectual tradition of India, as well as in actual governance of states at the time? That is very difficult to tell. Only thing I can say is that Arthashastra, having translated it, I know how detailed it is. It is so detailed on everything, including simple things like metallurgy, jewelry making, horse training, maintaining of elephants, etc., horticulture, agriculture. So much so that this must have been viewed as a handbook for bureaucrats within a state, within an empire, probably not an empire, but state, that it would have, let me put it this way, people write in order to make some money out of it. That is true of everything, right? And Arthashastra could not have been written the way it is if some kind of sponsorship, patronage was not there. I always ask students, look at the Mahabharata. Who the hell wrote it? It is so big, so cumbersome. What an enormous, giant undertaking. Who paid for it? That's a question that often we don't ask, right? And I think it's the same thing with the Kautilya Arthashastra. There must have been some kind of patronage for it to be born, and of course for it to survive at least for some time. But how it was actually used in ancient Indian states, we really do not know. We're down to 6, I think. We should go a little faster, otherwise
We only have a couple, I think, a question on Ashoka and one on
okay.
legal system, and then we'll open to the audience for
All right.
any other questions they may have.
Thank you, Professor Olivelle. We were, Pushkar and I, and all of us in Caucus, we were quite intrigued by recent work on comparative law, the Cambridge Comparative History of Ancient Law.
Oh, yeah.
There are two parts to this question as well. So on the issue of law, Dharmasastra developed during a period of socio-political and intellectual ferment in ancient India, right? And how do you see its emergence as a sort of tension and a response to competing ideologies of Buddhism and Jainism in defining dharma? And what was the sort of theological or socio-political imperatives that necessitated its codification as the Dharmasastra? And secondly, also could you tell us a bit about how you came to the idea of writing such a synchronic and expansive account, particularly of the evolution of legal systems in the ancient world?
Oh, I can do the second one first. It's easier. I didn't do it. It's easier to say. This particular project was started by two scholars, one in London and one in Cambridge. Both were Roman law scholars, Caroline Humphreys and David Ibbotson, who then invited me to join the group. So that's the three of us became the editors of. But we all had probably around 15 other scholars to do that. The uniqueness of the model is that in the past, when people wrote about ancient law, like Maine's is ancient law, they said they had one section on Chinese law, one section on Indian law, one section on Akkadian law, one section on Egyptian law, one section on Roman law, one section on Greek law. That's it, right? There was no, they didn't bring these systems into dialogue with each other. People commit crimes in every society. Right? People have land disputes. People have disputes about who borrowed what debt. All these things are found in every society. How do those societies deal with that? Right? In different ways. So that's the theory. So one person writes a chapter dedicated to one area. For example, law as text, law and religion. I wrote the chapter on legal procedure. What are the procedures that a court has to follow? So, and then, because I don't know everything about China or ancient, I had 5 or 6 collaborators who would send me material from their own perspectives, which I could gather and then make it into a chapter. Right? That's the issue, and so that's the uniqueness of this particular work as opposed to other histories of ancient law that they. Coming to the second one, which is about Dharmasastra. Interestingly, many Brahmanical texts, but especially the Dharmasastras, operate as if Buddhism didn't exist, except for us, 1 or 2 mentions, of people who are, Chaitya worshippers and something. So in a sense, it's a very interesting, because the Brahmanicals were working within the context of eternality. So what they write is not constrained by historical circumstances. So they worked, I don't say they worked independently of what was happening around them, but they at least didn't address those directly. So what the historical circumstances within which Manu wrote or Yajnavalkya wrote were the subtext, which we have to sort of dig and discover rather than, for example, Manu is so adamant against Shudras, the way that it's not in the Dharmasutras. The Shudras were there in Dharmasutras, but the Dharmasutras talk about Shudras being servants and preparing food and giving to the Brahmins to eat, etc. But Manu becomes, virulently anti-Shudra, and he especially says, do not live in a Shudra Rajyena Nivaset. One should not live in a kingdom that is run by Shudras. Now this becomes strange because Manu also says that the Shudras should not have any wealth, no money, no property. How can these people be running a country? There is something dissonant there. That's where we can dig into the subtext, that his Shudras are really not Shudras. He calls anybody he doesn't like Shudras, right? And some of what he calls Shudras may well be Buddhists. That's my sort of thing. But this is, trying to find what does Shudra mean for Manu. It's like in America, you call somebody an atheist. An atheist is a bad word you throw at other people. It doesn't describe that person. It's not that self-identification of that person, but it's just a thing. Shudra. So I think that's the. So what I think of the Dharmashastras is that by Manu and Manu time, you find them using the Arthashastric material in a way that made Arthashastra obsolete. One reason I think why Arthashastra finally became obsolete is Dharmashastra has absorbed it. So chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Manu are all Arthashastra, right? So that, and then they claim to, Dharmashastra claim to then be the handbook or guidance for people living a correct, good life, for society to organize itself, and especially for the king, how he should behave, how he should punish people who are acting illegally, etc. So in a sense, I think Dharmashastra arrogated to itself this very large social enterprise, trying to become the vehicle through which the society organized itself. Whether it was successful or not, we do not know, because I'm sure there would have been at the time other power centers that tried to do otherwise. But that is, I think, what they were trying to do. It was a way in which the Brahminical writers of Dharmashastras arrogated to themselves the power of molding society, both at the imperial or the royal level, as well as the ordinary life of ordinary people here.
So just one final question, and we'll open up to the audience.
Yes.
In a cyclical manner, since we started off also on your opening note by discussing or alluding to Ashoka, work on Ashoka.
Yeah.
It's a question essentially on Ashoka's Dhamma, because Raja Ashok has been invoked by statesmen as eminent as Pandit Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, when he in his discovery of India, and he's still brought up when it comes to his ideals of Dhamma and statescraft. So how do you assess the significance of Ashok? Is he being magnified, or was he magnified in retrospect, or was he as important and as influential a statesman and emperor in his times? And for a bit of context, for the non-history students here, we have had some scholars like Christopher Beckwith who have ascribed many of the edicts even to his predecessor Bindusar, and as well as to a later Kushan period. So how did you come across writing the biography, and how do you assess his importance and his relevance based on your research?
Yeah. First, Chris Beckwith is a friend of mine. He and I were colleagues at Indiana University, and I know Chris. He's not an Indian historian. You should dismiss what he says about Ashoka as irrelevant. Okay, that out of the way. With regard to Ashoka's writing, this whole thing about did Ashoka write Ashoka's inscription, it reminds me of, did Shakespeare write his plays? Right. All right. Let's at least say we are talking about the person who wrote those plays, and forget about Shakespeare or person who wrote. Anyway, I think Ashoka, I believe, wrote what he wrote. The Mauryan Empire collapsed soon after he died. There would not have been much incentive for later descendants of Ashoka to write, because we have no inscriptional or very little inscriptional, except for one donative inscription by Bindusara, to have those for him. It would have been easy for his descendants to continue the inscriptional activity of Ashoka, but they don't. So I personally take Ashoka's inscriptions as we have them. There are some spurious ones that Harry Falk has identified, but on the whole, has to be his. With regard to the major question, that what influence did he have? I think he had enormous influence during his lifetime. Let's take a simple thing, like the manufacture of Ashokan pillars. Today, it will be an enormous undertaking, at which probably many Indian governments will fail, right? Knowing the bureaucracy. He succeeded in doing that within a short period of time of about maybe 10 years, right? How did he get the technology? Didn't exist, of carving very heavy, very long, very big pillars out of living rock, right? The only two places that there was some technology was Persia, but Persian ones were small. They were like drums put on top of each other. The only monolithic ones that you have like that is in Egypt with the obelisk, right? Did he get his technology from all the way from Egypt? Somehow technology has come. And the Ashokan polish, the kind of exquisite carvings that he has on the capitals, right? And the polish, which you call the Maurya polish, actually not a Maurya polish, it is the Ashokan polish. How did those craftsmen do that? Because it's not found afterwards. It's like a mushroom, comes and then it's gone. And that polish is still there after 2,300 years. In other words, I'm trying to say that his influence he would have had a great impact within India during that time, at least in some parts of India, not possibly everywhere. What impact did he have after his death? That is an issue I deal with in the prologue, in the epilogue of my book, a little bit. That is something that Ashoka would have been disappointed in. Because I don't think there was a great impact on later times. Kings did not follow his instructions with regard to Dharma. Although his name was there in writing in 150, so which is about 300 years later, you find the Rudradaman inscription, where Ashoka is mentioned by the name Piyadasi. But then he falls into a memory hole, except for the Buddhists. Buddhists maintain the centrality of Ashoka for their. I translated the book called Buddha Charita by Ashvaghosha, a 2nd century Kushana text. And the Ashvaghosha, the great poet, concludes his Buddha Charita with what? Not with the death of the Buddha, not with anything else, but with Ashoka building 8,000 stupas. That's the conquest of Buddhism of India that Ashoka made. So Ashoka remained vital to the Buddhist tradition, but not elsewhere. I think until 1850s, when Princeps deciphered the Ashokan inscription, the script, and then the Ashokan texts were available to modern scholars. So Ashoka was brought back to life in India by the much maligned colonial powers. The archaeological department, especially. And with one little anecdote. Ashoka is a very common name in India today, right? I'm sure you have a lot of friends who are called Ashok, boys especially. I don't think there were any Ashoks in India before the 20th century. That name was unknown. So that's an interesting aspect. So yes, Ashoka has had a tremendous impact on modern India because of the discovery of Ashoka that Nehru made, and I talk about that in my epilogue, how Ashokan emblems became India's emblems in the rupee notes, in the Indian flag, and all of that, right? Ashoka looms large over modern India. But I don't think he loomed large over ancient India for probably 2,000 years. Yeah? Or maybe a little less, maybe 1,900 years. He did not loom large. But some of what he bequeathed has endured. When you all, in whatever language you write, Hindi or Gujarati or Bengali, you're all indebted to Ashoka. Because all your scripts are derived from Ashoka's script. Right? All Indian scripts. Not just Indian, but also once you go into Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka. Right? So there are things. And you all asked about the ahimsa, right? the concept of ahimsa that is so central to him. It is the very first in his major rock inscription, the very first inscription, he deals with ahimsa, which he calls vihisa, so with a vihimsa. Yeah, that was the very central thing. And I've written an article very recently about to kill or not to kill. That is the question in India throughout and it becomes a real issue. Ahimsa is a problem, for any state, any person. If somebody comes to kill you, can you kill that person? Can you kill a mosquito who is biting you? Can you have an army that goes out and kills? Can you execute criminals? I mean, all those things, and they are dealt with in Indian texts over the centuries. So those are important things. With regard to dharma and dhamma that you all have a thing, please don't worry about that. It is completely bogus. Dharma is not Hindu. Dhamma is not Buddhist. They're the same thing, except that Middle Indo-Aryan languages have a different phonetic system than Sanskrit. So when Buddhists write in Sanskrit, they use the term dharma. And when Indians in the past used Middle Indo-Aryan languages, they used the term dhamma or dhangma or several other drama. There are many other ways of saying that. It's the same thing. This is just a invented distinction that people are using today for whatever purpose, I don't know, but it has nothing, no historical or linguistic basis. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Now we have a question by Shubhangi Yadav. She asks, what light do texts such as Panchatantra shed on the descriptive normative dichotomy when it comes to ancient Indian history? Do they dispel the notion of Sanskrit being an exclusive elite language?
Yeah, so Panchatantra may not be the best example, because Panchatantra presents itself as a normative text, not a descriptive text. It calls itself a text of Arthashastra, right? So that is what we have to admit. But it teaches, its medium of instruction is to children, and therefore it is through the medium of storytelling, right? Storytelling. So that's the difference. But there is a distinction between normative, and the most normative, I think of it as a spectrum. One side, normative, more or less, mostly, right? Other side, mostly descriptive. But there's things fall within the spectrum, right? It's not a one or the other, it's not a dichotomy. So the most normative of the text would be what we know as Brahmanas in the Vedic text, but especially in the later times, the Dharmasutras, they'll be the normative, right? Arthashastra is a normative text. Descriptive text, and somewhere in the middle falls epic texts like the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and others. And on the more descriptive would be texts such as poetry, drama, Kalidasa's dramas, Kalidasa's poetry, Bhasa. I mean, all the major Sanskrit playwrights and poets, they would fall on that side. But what I don't like about the dichotomy is with regard to history, because you are historians, much of what we could trust as to how things were in the past come from the descriptive sections, because they don't have a bone to, axe to grind, and therefore what they say we can think of as more or less accurate. For example, in one of the plays, we have a scene of a of a court session where a lawsuit is. And then it tells you what is happening. And there are some similarities to what the Dharmasutras say as to how a court should conduct a session. So those are the kind of thing that we can get. Normative texts, on the other hand, tells you what should be rather than what is. And there again, I think we had to be a little careful, because no human being writing, even at a very abstract level, is immune to influences from his surroundings, from his historical circumstances. So if you are a little careful, if you read between the lines, if you go behind the text, go to the subtext, we should be able to find some historically relevant cases. I'll give you one brief example. Many of these texts say women should not own property. Women now call nirdana, without dana. But then, on the other hand, when they're talking about something else, they say this woman should be fined. And in fact, some Dharmashastras say the husband should fine the wife. What the hell are they talking about? If women had nothing, how can the women pay fines? You see the dissonance. That's where we can enter into that breach and find out, yes, women did have property. Because if you go and look at some of the donative inscriptions, the very large Buddhist donative inscriptions, they were given by women. Donations were made by women, that they control wealth. So that's the brief answer. All right, let's go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful answer. Now, moving forward, Prisha has a question. She asks, good evening, sir. You've been a prolific translator, having translated texts across vast eras and contexts, from the early Upanishads to the Panchatantra. What difficulties does a translator encounter while working on such texts, and how do you acquire such a wide temporal and social range when it comes to working on texts in Sanskrit, a language already renowned for being more copious than Latin?
Yeah. Yes. So about my working on it, as I said, accidents happened and I was forced to work in some areas. Not that I went into this saying that I'm going to translate these 10 things, you don't do that. But to answer the more substantive part of the question is to repeat something that I said with respect to philology earlier, right? When you're translating a text, you get into a very intimate relationship with the person who wrote that text. And I think beyond that, I, as a translator, must come to this text with an enormous degree of respect for the author who wrote the text, and with a degree of humility that I may not be able to fully comprehend what the author is trying to say. Both those things, I think. And I think with regard to the respect, remember, a text written 2,000 years ago had to be rewritten every 100 years or so for it to survive in the Indian climate. A text that is written on a palm leaf manuscript or a piece of birch bark has a lifespan of 100, maybe 200 years at the most. After that, the famous Indian climate will take it, right? The termites and white ants and whatever. Today they last longer because they are in climate-controlled libraries. So the respect is that people over 20 generations or more have thought it important to sit down and write this text again in their own hand. or paid somebody to do that. Which means a lot of people for 2000 years, 1000 years, 1500 years, or even more with regard to the Upanishads, 2500 years, thought this text was important in their lives for them. So that's the respect not just to the author, but because of the response, the reader response that I said. Humility because I do not fully understand what this person is telling me, because I'm so distant in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of upbringing, my own life experience, etc. So you go to it with how do you overcome these deficiencies? So you have to have what we call a source language, which is Sanskrit, and a target language, which is English. How do you bridge this, right? English is not the same as Sanskrit. And that is where philology comes in, that I talked about earlier. Philology meaning reading the text closely, attending to every detail of the language, of the sentence, of the paragraph, of intratextual connections, what the author says at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, how they are connected. And then looking at these words, does the word mean the same thing? Take the word dharma, which we talked about a minute ago. Does the word dharma mean the same thing to this author as it did to somebody else? Because dharma is a text, is a word with vast semantic range. So I think that's what we are trying to do. And then to leave the Sanskrit behind and to render what that person is saying into English that is elegant, that is readable, that a person who does not know Sanskrit will enjoy reading. That's the translator, I think, trying to translator becomes the mediator then. But there's a lot of me in my translation. That is why I said earlier. I didn't hear.
No, so please continue.
Yeah. So that is, I think, the lot of me into it, and I don't want people to use me, my translation, as the final word in what the author says. Right? That's what happened. Okay. Anything else that's coming? I see some things here. I don't.
Thank you, Professor Patrick, for that very insightful answer. Now we have a question by Surya. He asks, how do you evaluate the advent of writing in India? Does DC Sirkar's contention that Ashoka invented writing hold water in today's time?
Yeah. Yes, I think, I don't have much to say because I'm not an epigraphical expert, but I have friends who are epigraphists and dealing with that. The issue, of course, as many have tried to show, both Sirka and then Falk and Hinuber, a lot of others in the West, we really don't have any writing in India prior to Ashoka. Can we then, from that, conclude that Ashoka invented his script? But this has some problems, because Ashoka wrote in two scripts, not in one, right? So if he invented the script, did he invent both? Probably not. So there was one script, the Kharoshti, that was there in the Gandhara region, up what is today northwestern Pakistan. That Kharoshti was read from right to left, not from left to right, right? And it was very much connected to Aramaic, which was the official language of the Achaemenid Empire of Persia. Brahmi script, which became the mother of all scripts in India, is first used by Ashoka in the rest of India, right? It's clear that that other parts of India did not have a script that was as entrenched as the Kharoshthi in Northwest. There have been some discoveries of potsherds, the broken pieces of pottery, where scholars discovered both in India, southern India, and in Sri Lanka, have thought that there is writing on it. It is still disputed. So I'm really agnostic about this, whether there was writing before Ashoka or not. My inclination is probably that there was, but that Ashoka, in some sense, probably, or Ashoka's people, scholars, scribes whom he used, did make that script usable for writing Sanskrit. Kharoshthi was not suitable for Sanskrit or even Middle Indo-Aryan, the Magadhi language in which Ashoka was writing. The various sounds that you find, the three sibilants, sir, sure, and long vowels, short vowels, those are not represented in Kharoshthi. So that becomes a problem. But it did. But, ultimately, this is a storm in a teacup. It does not really matter. Yes, Ashoka's prominence in Indian history will go up, become enormous, if he actually invented the script rather than merely using the script. In either case, he was the first to use it and popularize it within India. We have 15 more minutes.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So, with that being said, most of the other questions that have been asked on the chat box have been answered in one form or another. So, with that being said, I would just like to end this session with the final question before the vote of thanks. And this question is sent to us by Sachin Chapagai. He asks, is studying ancient history and culture, Dharma in this case, still relevant in today's day and age?
Well, I like to be irrelevant often, because relevance is, I think, overvalued. What is relevant today may not be relevant in 10 years. So I'm not worried about that very much. The question may be asking whether ancient India has anything to say to modern India. I could frame it that way. And I think there is. And the whole reason for my writing the biography of Ashoka and for Ramachandra Guha to start this series on major Indian figures, cultural figures, not just political, is to show that what went before can and do have lessons for contemporary society. There's always a saying, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it, right? And I think some of one thing we have to say, it's like, what's the relevance of going and climbing Mount Everest? None. Everybody will happily in the world if somebody doesn't go and climb that mountain, right? But a lot of people do that because it's a challenge and it's an adventure. People are curious. The curiosity is what drives human beings and what drives scholarship. And I think studying history should not merely be a way, a means for something else, but it could be an end in itself. I like studying history. I like reading ancient texts. that doesn't necessarily mean that modern society will be transformed if they only read this, right? You read Shakespeare, you read Kalidasa, because they bring joy. And joy is a end in itself. You don't become joyful because, oh, it makes me better at something else, right? And I think to some degree, our scholarship should be like that. You do it. One of my former students, who is now, he's a full professor, said about me, which I thought was a nice thing to say, is that Patrick is like a musician. If he doesn't play the instrument, somehow the day is not right. You're a musician, you have to have music, you have to produce music. And I think that's what I try to do is to work on my things, even though I don't have to. I'm doing that not because I need to do it or I gain something from it. I gain something merely like a musician gains by producing beautiful music. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for answering the questions. Now I would like to invite the Vice President of Caucus, Rajneesh, to take over for the vote of thanks. Over to you, Rajneesh.
Thank you, Saksam. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College, I would like to extend heartfelt gratitude to Professor Patrick Olivelle for sharing his profound knowledge and insights on our reflections on India's ancient past. Your deep knowledge and contribution to the field of Indology have left us all inspired and enlightened. The way you delved into the nuances of India's ancient socioculture and intellectual heritage was really amazing. Thank you for taking time to engage with us and for generously sharing your wisdom. We are truly honored to have had the opportunity to learn from you. I would also like to thank our TIC, Dr. Saurabh sir, for helping us in all our endeavors. And I would also like to thank all the participants and members for actively participating in this seminar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much. And hope you have a good day and wish you all the best for your future studies.